A musket cracks at dawn, April 19, 1775. On Lexington Green, farmers defy an empire firing the shot that births a nation. Welcome to Legacy Line, where history ignites. Lexington and Concord, the day America fought back, blazes in 2025, the 250th anniversary. Charge with Paul Revere, stand with the Minutemen, and witness the shot heard round the world in 15 minutes of epic history. Smash that like, subscribe, and answer in the comments what's worth fighting for today. Before shots were fired at Lexington and Concord, the colonies and Britain were already on a collision course. The storm had been brewing for more than a decade. After the French and Indian War ended in 1763, Britain stood victorious, but also drowning in debt. To pay for its empire, Parliament turned to the American colonies. New taxes were passed: the Stamp Act, the Townshend Acts, and later the Tea Act. To London, these were fair contributions. But to the colonists, it was tyranny. The phrase, "no taxation without representation," echoed through taverns, meeting halls, and churches. Why should they pay taxes to a government where they had no voice? Protests soon turned into open defiance. In 1770, British soldiers fired on a crowd in Boston, an event seared into memory as the Boston Massacre. 3 years later, in 1773, resistance boiled over again when colonists disguised as Native Americans boarded ships and dumped an entire shipment of tea into Boston Harbor. This became known as the Boston Tea Party. Britain struck back hard. Parliament closed Boston's port, dissolved local assemblies, and placed Massachusetts under direct military rule. These harsh laws were known across the colonies as the Intolerable Acts. Instead of dividing the colonists, they united them. Militias began drilling in secret. Men called Minutemen pledged to be ready to fight at a moment's notice. Committees of correspondence spread news and warnings from town to town, building a network of resistance. By early 1775, the air in Massachusetts was electric. The colonists knew Britain would try to crush the movement, and the British knew rebellion was slipping out of control. The question was no longer if a clash would happen, but when and where. By the spring of 1775, British General Thomas Gage, the military governor of Massachusetts, faced an impossible problem. His orders from London were clear: restore order and crush the growing rebellion. But in reality, Boston was surrounded by angry colonists, and the countryside was alive with militias arming themselves for war. Rumors swirled that weapons, gunpowder, and ammunition were being stockpiled in the town of Concord, just 20 miles from Boston. Even more alarming, two of the rebellion's most important leaders, Samuel Adams and John Hancock, were hiding nearby. If Gage could move quickly, he could seize the weapons, arrest the leaders, and perhaps end the revolution before it truly began. On the night of April 18, 1775, Gage made his move. He ordered nearly 700 British regulars, disciplined, heavily armed soldiers, to march silently out of Boston under the cover of darkness. Their mission was simple: march to Concord, destroy the military supplies, and capture Adams and Hancock along the way. But there was one problem the British had not counted on. The colonists had eyes and ears everywhere. Spies in Boston already knew of Gage's plan. The moment the Redcoats began moving, the alarm would spread like wildfire. And so, as the soldiers quietly boarded boats to cross the Charles River, another drama was already unfolding: the ride of a silversmith named Paul Revere. Just before sunrise on April 19, 1775, the British column approached the small village of Lexington. On the town green, about 70 local Minutemen stood waiting. They were farmers, blacksmiths, and shopkeepers, ordinary men facing the most feared army in the world. Their commander, Captain John Parker, knew the odds. He reportedly told his men, "Stand your ground. Don't fire unless fired upon. But if they mean to have a war, let it begin here." The Redcoats marched into view. Hundreds of disciplined soldiers, bayonets fixed, drums beating. The two sides faced each other in a tense silence. Then suddenly, a shot. No one knows who fired it. Some say it came from the colonial line. Others whisper it was a nervous soldier or even an accidental misfire. But that single gunshot cracked open history. In seconds, the British unleashed a volley of musket fire. Smoke filled the air, screams echoed across the green. When it was over, 8 colonists lay dead, 10 more wounded. The British cheered their victory and pressed on toward Concord, convinced they had scattered the rebellion. But they had done something far more dangerous. With that first volley, the war had begun. The world had heard the shot heard round the world. After leaving blood behind at Lexington, the British troops marched onward to Concord. Their orders were clear: find the weapons stockpiled by the colonists and destroy them. By mid-morning, the Redcoats arrived and began searching barns, homes, and fields. They found some supplies and set fire to wooden gun carriages. Smoke began to rise over the town. From a distance, it looked as though Concord itself was burning. On the far side of town, several hundred Minutemen were gathering near the North Bridge. They watched the smoke rise and believed their homes were under attack. Their anger boiled over. Around 400 colonists advanced toward the bridge where a small British force stood guard. The Redcoats shouted warnings ordering the colonists to turn back. But the militia kept marching forward. Then the British fired a few warning shots, hitting 2 Americans. That was enough. The colonists raised their muskets and returned fire with deadly accuracy. The British line broke. Shocked by the ferocity of the militia, the Redcoats retreated in confusion. For the first time, local farmers and shopkeepers had forced trained British regulars to fall back. The rebels rushed across the bridge, cheering. The news spread instantly. Ordinary Americans had stood against the King's army and driven them back. What began at Lexington as tragedy had now turned into triumph at Concord. But the day was not over. The British still had to march back to Boston. And along the way, the countryside was waiting for them with muskets ready. The British troops now faced a harsh reality. They were miles from Boston, deep in hostile territory, and the road home stretched nearly 18 miles. What began as a confident mission to crush rebellion was about to become a desperate fight for survival. As the Redcoats marched out of Concord, the countryside exploded with resistance. Minutemen poured in from every town and village, farmers dropping their plows, smiths leaving their forges, all grabbing muskets to join the fight. From behind stone walls, fences, and trees, shots rang out. A steady rain of musket fire harassed the British from every direction. The disciplined red lines of soldiers began to crumble under constant ambush. One British soldier later wrote that the colonists fought like invisible shadows, firing from behind cover and disappearing before the Redcoats could strike back. To the exhausted troops, every farmhouse and tree seemed alive with danger. The retreat turned into chaos. Ammunition ran low, men collapsed from fatigue, and the wounded clogged the road. By the time reinforcements finally reached them outside Boston, nearly 300 British soldiers were dead, wounded, or missing. The colonists, in comparison, had lost fewer than 100. That day, the myth of British invincibility was shattered. The world's strongest army had been humbled by farmers and townsmen defending their homes. What began as a march of control had ended in humiliation and a revolution that could no longer be stopped. When the smoke cleared on April 19, 1775, the world was forever changed. The British Army, proud, disciplined, and feared across the globe, had been bloodied by local farmers and shopkeepers. The colonists had not only stood their ground, they had driven the Redcoats back to Boston. News of the battles spread like wildfire. Messengers raced through the countryside, carrying the story of resistance to every colony. Within days, militias from across New England converged on Boston. In less than 2 weeks, nearly 20,000 colonists surrounded the city, beginning the siege of Boston. To the British, Lexington and Concord were supposed to be a warning, a show of power to crush rebellion. Instead, they became a rallying cry. Across the colonies, men and women realized that compromise with Britain was slipping away. The first blood of the Revolution had been spilled, and there was no turning back. Lexington and Concord were no longer just local skirmishes. They were the birth cries of a new nation, an unmistakable signal that America was ready to fight for its freedom. On April 19, 1775, in the small towns of Lexington and Concord, history turned on a single gunshot. Ordinary men, farmers, merchants, and craftsmen stood against the most powerful army in the world, and in doing so, they lit the flame of a revolution. The lesson of that day is timeless. Freedom is never granted. It is earned. It is defended not by kings or empires, but by ordinary people willing to risk everything for the promise of liberty. Lexington and Concord remind us that great change does not always begin in capitals or palaces. Sometimes it begins on a village green, with neighbors standing shoulder to shoulder, refusing to surrender their rights. From those first defiant shots came a movement that would shape not only America, but the entire world's understanding of freedom and self-government. The day America fought back was not just the birth of a nation, it was the birth of an idea that still inspires people everywhere who believe in liberty, justice, and the courage to stand their ground.